So thank you guys for joining today. I am privileged that you guys decided to come to this session. I'm excited to be part of Tableau and using Tableau. So I'm appreciative that you all decided to come. And so, especially after I saw the sheer volume of what was available today, I was honored. So now I'll get out of this. So my name is Jason Lockismo. It's probably one of the names that if you could pronounce the last name right off the bat, you're probably in the 0.001% of the world. My entire life, it's been all kinds of variations that none of which are flattering. That said, I'm completely okay with whatever you call me. Well, almost whatever you call me. So it's pronounced Lockismo. It's Norwegian. I'm at Pearson. Pearson is a education technology company, and I oversee our analytics for product management. And I'll be going into what that is a little bit later today. One thing that I want to call out, especially since we have a limited number, so we know that from a quantitative standpoint, there's few in here, so you are well representing the survey here, which I greatly appreciate. We have both quantitative measures and qualitative measures. So one of my former good friends and bosses gave me this great piece of information. They said, feedback is a gift. And so what I'd like you to do, if you can, is there's a thing that says added feedback or additional feedback. If you would provide any, like, hey, this was great, or I really didn't understand this, or you can email me later. I'd love to get your actual feedback, because feedback actually is a gift. It helps me get better. So a little bit about me. I am relentless about pursuing the best in others. And so for what you're going to see today, you're going to see the team that I get to work with. You're going to see their work. You're not going to see my work, other than that Tableau dashboard that's pretty generic and basic in the beginning, just so I can figure out what to do here. But you're going to see their work. And so the benefit that I get is I get the opportunity to work with such amazing people. But they're such amazing people, and they stick with me because I am relentless about pursuing their best. My goal is to essentially take out as many blockers as I possibly can, and then bring them coffee and donuts all the other times, because they're the ones actually doing the work. And in all honesty, when we present inside of our organization, the work that we do, more often they're the ones actually doing their presentations, because they're the subject matter experts. They're the ones that have done all the hard work. They know what questions are going to be asked that I won't, and might as well put a subject matter expert in front of the CEO or the president or CFO, because I don't want to be the one. Let me get back to you on that, especially when we can answer it right then. I'm also hopelessly consumed with solving problems. So that has pros and cons. I was given a God-given gift of dyslexia, and with that comes what I call a superpower. The superpower is the ability to connect a whole bunch of random dots, because what we've learned now about the brain is with dyslexia, you've got the way that you're processing information isn't necessarily linear. You're also using different parts of your brain for reading and such. And so for any of you out there who also have dyslexia, consider it a superpower. For me, it's actually been one of those things that because of the hard work that I had to do going through school, I was able to figure out new things. I realized that this node somehow could connect to that node. And I didn't have to go through a whole bunch of process. I could just start connecting dots. And so the advantage of that is in problem solving. So when you're trying to solve a problem you don't know the answer to, you have to try different variables. You have to try different things. And so I am hopelessly consumed with solving problems. Pearson has a large set of problems. One of those problems is, how do we actually know if we're building efficacious content? So ultimately, you all are, in some form or another, learners. Or you have kids. So efficacious, we want to make sure that we're actually creating content that actually helps and isn't something that's just a means to an end. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other is, I never give up when the fight is worth fighting. So probably some of you have been in situations either in your family life or in your business life or in your professional life where you come up against substantial roadblocks. Sometimes that fight isn't worth fighting. And you're the one to be able to discern that. But there are cases where sometimes there is just so much red tape to get things moving forward that you may decide to not keep going. And what I would say is, for for those of us who have struggled and struggled, it can be depressing to see continuously folks make decisions that we think are the wrong decisions. So for me, how that relates actually to Tableau is Tableau was one of those products that we internally inside of Pearson was not the formal opponent. Oracle and its suite of tools and things were the ones that were enterprise worthy, and so Tableau was one of those kind of small, I'm not sure what that is or why it's valuable, and over the course of 3.5 years, we've now made it part of our enterprise solution. So that said, it wasn't like just, oh, we just went through these steps. It was a lot of wrestling relationships and understanding the dynamics and basically never giving up. So you're here listening to a variety of narratives, a variety of stories. And the beauty of what we get to see inside of visualization is we see so much more to that story than we may otherwise be able to see for reading. Again, for me, I always, partly because of the fact that I really struggle with reading, identify with movies. Or audio tracks. My imagination could run wild listening to audio. But also, I mean, who doesn't like a good movie? Like the session, there was a session just earlier from Netflix, right? How they're using analytics in a context of making stories. Story is important. And part of, I think, our goal, not knowing any of you really in the room, my guess is that you are creating a story. Or you're there to try to derive or define a story based on a subset of data or subset of information. So the beauty of data visualization is that we now have a palette to be able to actually show things that are otherwise unseeable. So some examples would be like learning. How do you know if someone's learning? Can anyone take a guess on anyone knows how someone's learning? Assessment. Is there another way of being able to test assessment? Is there another way of being able to understand if someone's learning? In a conversation? Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. So what's interesting is most often in education, the way that we address or understand if someone's learning is through an assessment. There's a kind of a new way of, it's not actually new, but a budding competitor to the old way, which is what's something called authentic assessment. Authentic assessment is something where we actually take an experience and we watch the experience to see if they actually know how they're doing it. For example, somebody may test really well. Somebody like, and that's great. What if in the real world though, they don't remember, or that's not something that they're capable of doing? For example, your doctor or a nurse. I don't want the nurse who knows how to do it all by the book. I want the nurse who actually knows how to put the IV in the first time, not like the 12th time. Because I don't want to experience that pain. And so authentic assessment is using the real world circumstances to actually understand if someone's learned something or knows how to do something. So what we are able to do with visualization and with data is, you can take massive amounts of information or small amounts of information and you can begin to show, you can give form to it. You can breathe life into ones and zeros. And to me, that's one of the most fascinating things about this space. And one of the things that I think I've loved most about working with tools like Tableau is because it's allowed us, and allowed me personally, to take information and begin to show a story. So let's talk about you. Now this is important. I'm doing an analysis, and this is about you. So I'm going to ask a set of questions, and I'm hopeful that you'll be honest and you'll actually participate. So who here in this room has an education? Has any form, level of education? Okay, that's 100%. Okay. Who here, I'm pretty certain I know the answer that it's 100%, but I'm going to say who here has gone to grade school? 100%. Okay, who here has a college education? Okay, wow, 100%. Obviously, I can't go test the validity of all this, but I'm pretty sure we're on the right track. So a show of hands who has a master's degree. Okay, that's like 60%. Who here has multiple master's degrees? Okay, that's more like 8%. Does anyone here have a PhD? Okay, only 5%. Does anyone here have multiple PhDs? Wow, it's okay. I had to find the breaking point. Who here has children in school? It could be grade school or college. Okay, 40%. How many active faculty do we have in the room? 2%. Okay, so here are the results. Everyone that has an education, 100%. Who's gone to grade school? 100%. Who's gone to college? Looks like 100%. Master's degrees, around 60%. Multiple master's degrees, 8 to 10%. PhDs, about 5%. Children in school, somewhere around 40%. Now again, you're also basing on my quick scan and how accurate that was, but we'll just say that that's the case. So the reason I call that out is because every one of you raised your hand around education. Has anyone gone through a course or remember a particular class where their only goal was to finish? Show of hands. There's anyone that didn't raise your hand? You actually were there to learn that material? I mean, that would be impressive. Most often, and we see it right now in our experiences, we watch how folks will go to what we would consider a summative assessment, which is at the end of a course. They're going to be taking their, what did they learn? And they're using that first. So they're actually using a summative assessment as a formative assessment. That's actually what I would do. So what I would want to know is, I'm there to get through the course. I would want to first assess, what do I know and not know, and then go back to the areas where I don't know. And so we get to see some of those behaviors. But what I want to call out is, each one of you in this room and your children are touched by education, are touched by learning. And so this is the very reason why Pearson is focused on developing efficacious products. The hard part is, you have this challenge between academia and business. We can sell a lot of product, but ultimately, are we selling good product? And so the CEO, John Fallon, put his stamp behind this back in 2000, before I joined the company in 2013, where they decided within 5 years they were going to have studies done across their 40 top products to determine how efficacious those top 40 products are. No other content company has done that. What they're basically saying is, we're going to actually identify what is actually working and what is good and what isn't. And so the main point on this slide is really just to say you are important. Everyone in this room is important, which you know that on some level, but Pearson sees that as important, as part of its goal and mission. Go back. So simple agenda, our single purpose, moving from a limited to an expansive analytics ecosystem. And then, what does learning actually look like in the data? So I'll be going through and demoing some of the team's work and actually looking at how are we using learner data to actually determine if things are working or not. And then how do we use that data in other contexts as well to help the business? So single purpose, Pearson. So there's some fun facts about Pearson. Pearson started in 1844. And it was a construction company. And Samuel Pearson decided, as a laborer, he decided he was going to start his own construction company. Now, what's fascinating to me is that within 60 years, Samuel Pearson had established one of the most successful global construction companies. Here are just a few of the things that they built in that time span. They built the Blackwell Tunnel under the Thames River in London, the Halifax Dry Dock in Canada, the East River Railway tunnels in New York City, the Mexican Grand Canal, which is what actually drained Mexico City, and numerous other railways and harbors around the world. So Pearson starts as an average laborer, not wanting to be under the man, and wanting to really create something new. Within 60 years, had scaled that, and he had brought some of his family members early on to help establish his construction company. And by the 20s, they decided as a company to move from construction to publishing. A pretty big shift. I mean, I would have loved to have been in that room when they're deciding. I'm sure it wasn't one conversation, but going from a substantial construction company to publishing. I mean, I have a hard time comprehending how these two worlds can coexist. But so in the 20s, they started acquiring. They were using their capital to acquire multiple different kinds of publishing companies around the world, and what they did in the 50s is they bought, and you guys will be familiar with this, The Economist, and or 50% share, I should say, of The Economist and the Financial Times. And so the Financial Times is a UK-based paper, and The Economist is something that we probably all recognize, at least by brand. So they wanted to expand their readership. Again, they're going for scale. Just like they had done with construction, they were going for scale in publishing. Well, as we move into the 90s, one of the things that they ended up doing is they started acquiring a whole bunch of other textbook companies. And they combined it with Pearson Education, their internal company to actually call it Pearson Education. Somewhere in the late 90s, they acquired All American Television, which was the creator and producer of Baywatch and various of other shows. So at one point in Pearson's history, they owned the rights to Baywatch. They actually created and owned. So it has a very interesting kind of background in terms of what it was doing. But the reason I'm painting the story is because it's a collection. Pearson ends up being a collection of companies, a wide number of companies. And so in the late 90s, early thousands, they decided to really start to hone down into a focal point. And that focal point was education. And so within education, what they were looking to do was address specific parts. And so what you've now seen over the last decade is you've seen Pearson actually selling off a wide variety of services, a wide variety of companies for the sole purpose of honing into specifically educational content. And so their mission now, formerly a construction company, is ultimately to help people make progress against their goals, against their learning goals. That's their mission. It really is that simple. And it resonates with everyone that's been part of the company for years, as well as those that are joining new. How do we actually help and build an experience for our learners and for our educators that actually help them make progress against their goals? So most of us here will have experienced an education in a more traditional context. Those of you that are in school today or getting your master's and PhDs may have a slightly different experience, but the traditional experience has been one with textbooks. Can anyone here give a guess on what kind of data you can collect on textbooks? Sales volume. Anything else? No, because it's a black market. We don't know it's resold. Follow-ups would know. Many other people might know. We wouldn't know. That's about it. Sales volumes. We can collect qualitative, so that's quantitative, right? We can collect qualitative information from our instructors and from those that we've sold our product to, but it's now conversation. And so what's interesting about this, and even here, I just pulled this off the internet, randomly, not realizing that even two of those books there are Pearson books. Pearson represents just roughly around just over 40% of the market share in higher ed. So all the educational content, it's highly likely that Pearson has touched. You have probably used a Pearson product at one point in your life. And you may not recognize it as the name Pearson because it's gone by a lot of other names, but if you've used products like Mastering or MyLabs, these are practice and homework tools that are used inside of courses that accompany a textbook. And so we're very strong in math. So again, it's highly likely that you've taken a course that uses Pearson content. And so this sales volume is around the majority of what could be done. However, now with the advent of technology and moving to a digital experience, we are not slowly, because we've been doing it for more than a decade with Mastering and MyLabs, but we are doing more and more with transitioning to a true digital-only experience. What does that do? It gives us quite a bit more data, right? So now that we can actually, now that we can see more than just sales volumes, you can actually see how people are actually using the content. So when we go back to that question that John Fallon had asked and made the statement, asked our company, but then made the statement to the public of, we are going to evaluate if we create efficacious content. How do we know? It requires data. And so what that meant is now we're looking at our top 40 products and evaluating with partners. I mean, it's not just doing just data analysis on our own data. It's actually working with a number of partnerships and institutions to be able to evaluate the longitudinal value and such. But what is interesting is the advent of digital creates an entirely new possibility for learning. So with this, if as a learner, or even as an educator, as I'm assigning, I can see, well, how long did it take Professor Johnson to actually develop that particular course? Or how long is it taking Professor Johnson to actually facilitate the course? Where is Professor Johnson struggling? I can almost guarantee you, Professor Johnson doesn't want to spend a lot of time inside an administrative dashboard to try to figure out how to set up a course. Nor do students want to go through the process of trying to figure out how to navigate. But this is kind of the challenge, right? So the print experience has been established, and we know, and people have been trained in it, so they know how to use it. So now as we evolve into a digital, how do you create a navigation that allows for the flexibility, but also the ability to comprehend what you're doing? How do you stay on track? But with this comes information at such a granular level that allows us to do things that are otherwise not possible in a traditional context. We can truly personalize the experience, because now we know the like Professor Johnsons. We can also know the like Jasons. So we can see who out there is struggling, and we can also identify what's the right path for me versus Jane. So Jason's path versus Jane's path. We can now use attributes to be able to help derive the right path. And so data's been used for quite some time in education. So this isn't anything new in terms of what's possible, but what is new is being able to bring to life a truly personalized experience, or even identifying early alerts. How do you know when a student's struggling? So what's interesting about the experience inside of Pearson, the Pearson content, is this is where much of the learning from a digital perspective and a digital footprint, I mean, we can't actually see in the minds of any of our learners, so I can't validate that. But based on what we'd say statistically and such, and through other studies, is that the learning is happening inside while they're in the content. Makes sense. They're reading, they're comprehending, they're testing, they're evaluating. So this is where we can see where are people actually struggling versus, are they making it to class on time? Are they making it through the course? Are they making it through each week? So progression is one element. This is a whole other dimension of information, a whole other dimension of being able to understand, are we actually helping learners learn? And where might they be struggling? Are there things that we can do with that we could otherwise not do? So again, efficacy, it's a big objective. So what I'm going to describe here for just a few minutes is limited to expansive. So when I first joined Pearson, I asked all the right questions of all the wrong people. And what that turned into was 6 months of going back and having to say sorry to a lot of different people that I bulldozed thinking that I knew the answer, which was we had all this data, it was a cornucopia of data, and I just needed to put some tools on top of it, and we'd be able to bring it to life in a way that it had never been brought to life, and they just needed me as an expert in the field to do that. Not so. So our charter in our particular function is to basically help our customers, which range from sales, marketing, product development teams, our content-specific teams, make evidence-based decisions that ultimately optimize that learner experience, or the educators, our customers' experience. And so the journey, like I said, I asked all the wrong people, all the right questions. So what that meant was for the first year is, what have I got myself into? What was interesting about Pearson is, remember how I said it's multiple companies, really just a holding company with multiple companies? Well, imagine all these, also by way of context, there's approximately across all of Pearson's around 120 million learners supported globally. It's a rather large footprint when you're talking about learners. Almost all of those different products have different backends with different schemas and different, and a lot of missing. And so when I first got there, is realizing only 6 months in, it took me 6 months to get there, which is probably doesn't say too well about myself. But then went back, and then we started figuring out, okay, well, what do we need to do? Well, what we ended up needing to do is we needed to create a true analytics ecosystem. So I had been in an experience where we had a BI, what is a traditional BI experience, but really what we wanted to do is I want to be able to go to the most granular layer of the data, so that way when I need to pivot to a new answer, or a new question to answer, I can do so without having to go back to the engineering team to have them re-aggregate data in some forms. So how can I keep all these billions of rows of data in a state that allows me to continue to put new scaffolding on top? So in some ways, because there wasn't a pre-established true analytics ecosystem that went across all of them, it was an opportunity. A really tough 2.5-year opportunity. But at the end of that, and so the other thing that was funny is because we also often said that we didn't have, we would often say, well, we have big data, which in fact by volume it did, but you couldn't actually access it. So then my question really was, well, do we actually have big data? Not that it wasn't in storage, but like, can we access it? Can we do anything with it? So it's kind of locked away. And I remember the first person who joined the team, trying to get them access to the actual learner data, it took 6 months. It was just one person on the other end had to create an account for that person, but it took 6 months to figure out how to navigate that. So we are not a case study of how to do this well when it comes to creating environments in the past, but hopefully with what we've been able to do recently, we can demonstrate. The other thing is we realized, now that we actually have access to the data, we realized, well, there's a lot of holes, a lot of holes. And so that required a lot of instrumentation, a lot of work required to actually collect data that otherwise wasn't, that wasn't being collected. And without that information, we can't answer these key questions. So we would be getting asked these questions, these data-starved people, how do we actually, we want to know the answer to A, B, and C, and I wouldn't be able to provide them any answers because the data didn't exist. That isn't a happy scenario. Well, we have all this data, I know, but you have all the data that you can't use and it's not actually relevant. So what we did is we created this kind of exemplifies it. In 2014, we only had access to sales and registration data. So going back to the earlier comment, what could you do analysis on from just textbooks? Well, we basically had the same information across all of our products, but that's all we had access to. And so this was essentially the other thing that you'll see locked away was we've got our next generation products that we're building, and it's all this data, which is a plethora, is just locked away in S3. And there was no access point. There was no way to actually access it. And so from over the course of 18 months, really, we essentially started building out our platform in a more modular way to allow us to continue to explore and try new things. Because what we found is we would start going down the road with one solution and then it would break, or we'd hit its limitations based on the volumes. And so the struggle with that was, well, how do we know what's going to come next? And so, for example, at one point, we were using, we use a couple different products between now and this, we use Oracle as our environment inside of S3, or inside of Amazon, to be able to develop marts and do analysis against. And then we hit the upper bounds of that, and we're really limited by its performance. And so we moved to Redshift. And so as part of the Amazon stack, now Redshift has its own limitations. At the same time, we now had access to the mirrors of our product events or our learner activity data, and we started pumping some of that data into this ecosystem. Because what we ultimately wanted is we wanted an ecosystem where you could actually connect all the dots in one place without having to try to do it manually or by hand, because if anyone here has worked with data, which I'm guessing all of you have in some form or fashion, that's a pain in the ass. And so, one of the things that we were also doing as the product analytics team is and this was kind of the advent of Server, is we actually started with a small test case of 30 seats. We bought 30 seats for Server to prove out an example of, and I had worked with Tableau at a previous organization, knew it could be successful, but wanted we needed to prove that this would work. Again, we're competing against the already established large vendors within the CIO organization. So how do we actually do that? Well, we had to prove it. So we started a small, 30-seat server test or pilot, and it was uber successful. Because what people were now able to do is they weren't just stuck like getting CSVs and then recreating their own analysis. We were enabling them not to just have access to the same data that they had, but presenting it them in a way that they could begin to interact and engage with it faster, which is like this is what Tableau does, or data visualization generally. You can use a variety of solutions. It now allowed them to actually answer the questions versus spend all this time curating and then developing and then asking the question to go back and ask more questions that you have to go back through this process. So we established our Tableau server last October. So we're just about a year. And over the course of, by the end of that particular year in 2016, we had around 450 users across our company, again, ranging from our product teams, our engineering teams, our sales teams, our content teams, our efficacy teams, being able to help support them with access to information. And again, there's still a limitation here. And so the limitation is it's one team that's ultimately a bottleneck for all the other teams. And so what we opted to do for this next year, or this year, has really been the adoption, focusing on adoption and helping others know how to use the product. And the growth across the organization has been substantial. So from our perspective and what we're trying to accomplish, we now have around 2,100 customers. And we've had to rearrange our ecosystem, but now we have an ecosystem that allows us to actually pivot the way that we need to in a cost-effective way. So we're using new technologies like Amazon Athena, which is very similar to that of like BigQuery. Allows you to do some things that are really cost-effective. You don't have to have these nodes up all the time. You can turn them on when you need to use them. From a computational standpoint. But with this kind of framework, it allows us to do things that were previously impossible at Pearson. So one of the biggest challenges that we've had as a portfolio is being able to see, well, what are people actually doing across the portfolio? We could see one product, and then you can look at a separate product, but you couldn't look at them together, which is in some ways it sounds crazy, but that's what we struggled with. And so, and we're talking a company that's been around for more than a century, right? You would have thought somewhere along the lines they would have gotten it right, but not until honestly this year has the company been able to actually see across the entire portfolio performance. So now we can give our executive team an ability to see across different facets, because that's the other thing is we want to be able to pivot very quickly. I want to look at a geography potentially, or I want to look at a dimension like the disciplines. How is the performance when I look at it via discipline? How is it when I look at different institutions? How is it when I look at specific kinds of titles? What's the performance? But the other big thing has been adoption. And so what we've really focused on this year is creating a capability and enabling many other teams who have also found Tableau to be leverageable for their purposes, to create a staging environment where they can come and they can publish their particular dashboards, and then through a set of best practices, eventually we publish them to production, and then they're able to broadcast their work to their particular part of the organization. So part of the objective initially started as this kind of grassroots. There was clearly more opportunity for the company, and so we were able to take advantage of that. So that's a long time, well, not actually too long, to get to the learning. So now what I want to do is I want to show you some examples of what does this mean? What does this data look like? And so, one of the questions that we want to be able to address, when I was saying earlier, how do we know where students are struggling? And so this particular dashboard was developed as part of a project because we're doing a project with IBM Watson. And with IBM Watson, what we want to do is inside of some of our products, we want to create an assistant, somebody that can actually help a learner. However, learners don't need assistance every single moment, every single step along the way. They need it in certain places. And so we needed to find the areas, essentially, out of the thousands of titles, what titles do you start with? What are the best titles to start with? And from the business, they had their set of 40. We collected data. We got those 40 down to about 12. And then from those 12, we narrowed it down to a few different titles. But one of the things that we did as an outcome of this is we were looking at different elements of trying to identify, well, where inside the content would we want to put Watson? Where inside the content would we want to actually, where are students struggling? And so what we were able to do is we were able to identify it in late adulthood section of this particular book that there was a consistent, like 60%, somewhere in the mid-60s to low 60s, and so this actually stood out as being problematic. The other thing we could see over here is we were able to identify, well, these particular questions were below the curve. So the x-axis is ultimately the percent correct. So after however many attempts they got, what was the correct percentage, the average correct percentage? On the correct on first try, though, which is our proxy for if they actually know the material or not, what was it? And so we can see anything that's below the 70% on the correct on first try, these are areas to evaluate. It's pretty simple. And so however, in this process of trying to figure out for Watson, one of the things that we identified that there was a particular place in module 10 under death and dying where there was something really peculiar going on. And what we found was in these 3 questions, that's what was leading to this 40% correct on first try. Now, ultimately, 84% would get it right. But again, what we're trying to understand is if you have unlimited attempts, eventually you're going to get 100%. If you had 3 attempts. So what we want to do is that first attempt is a way as a proxy to identify, do they actually understand, again, with the assumption that they've read or that they know something about it before they took it, which we then use web data or behavioral data to see if that's actually true. But what we identified here is, you'll see it says, and maybe you can't see because I'm even having a hard time, it says modern American funerals are grandiose and expensive largely because, and 28% get it right on the first try, because most people answered, American social norms essentially mandate that a funeral be complex and costly. Or that's the correct answer. Most people answered, and this would make sense if you've had a loved one pass, the survivors are motivated to provide the best for their loved ones. That's the wrong answer, according to the book. And so what was interesting is, well, which one's right? Who's right? Right? And so going back to it, what we did is we identified, there's a process you can use called item response theory to identify different curves. So we give tools like this to our content team so that they can then identify across, again, we're talking millions and millions of assessment items, so those are those questions and answers. How do you know which ones to tackle? How do you know which ones aren't working or are working? That's a very difficult task. And so part of what we've been doing is developing tools across the portfolio. Again, when I was saying that there's these disparate systems, it's a disparate system within higher education. So you'll have some disciplines in one ecosystem, other disciplines in yet another, and another. And so bringing it all together has been, like I said, up until recently, very, very difficult. So let's go back to that death and dying area. And what you'll see is, on the way that the graph is laid out, the x-axis is the student ability. So a low ability student to a high ability student. And then the probability of getting it correct. And so what you'll see is that S-curve. And the S-curve is what we want to see. We want to form our expectation of a learner and their ability to answer that question will fit some range of that S. But the curve should be consistent. But what you'll see is you'll see 2 immediate outliers. And what you'll see, and one is that basically the lowest ability student has the highest probability of getting it right. So right there, it's inverse. So there's something wrong with the question. And so you don't want to train Watson or your natural language processing algorithms on bad data. And so we don't want Watson to correct people in the wrong direction. Kind of going back to the AI comment this morning, AI is still code. You still have to program it. And so here we were able to identify, like, there's a problem here. So we took it back to the content teams. And so, but essentially, this ability to look at, because minutia matters, and every one of those learners' interactions matters. So even though there's millions and millions of assessment items and billions of rows of data, how do you actually use that? And so one of the things that we've been tackling is we've been focusing on making this data that's a plethora actionable. And so we basically build tools. And so and rather than building an analysis and then showing like this result, most of what we do today, probably 90+%, is focused on building a tool that somebody else can use. So they can do the discovery. Because again, we have new data flowing in all the time. And so somebody who's responsible, and there are many, many teams across the organization, people who are responsible to take action, we want to enable them. But at the same time, we also want to compare to learning objectives. So this is that same book. And what we can see, again, this is why we picked this area for Watson in particular, is because late adulthood, we were seeing this is an area where students are fundamentally struggling. The one that I was just showing you was in this 10th chapter, which was death and dying. Not a happy topic when you think about life, but a reality. And so, but what we could see is, by giving some of these tools to the teams, is that they could go in and they could start making changes, and they could look at the question level and look at the learning objective tied to it. Is it actually performing as we would expect? So another set of tools that we built for these teams was, well, okay, great. That's great for some set, but how do I across the portfolio identify, again, this is a tool, how do I identify which assessments are working or not? And so we built a set of tools that allow us to do that very simply. So this is not like your most pretty visualization, but is a very practical. Because our goal, again, is focused on action, and the folks that we're working with are steeped in a traditional context, and we want to help them be best at what they can be. And so we're providing them what they can use on their terms instead of providing them what we think that they should have, which never really works. It's really depending on what your customer needs. And so in conversation, what they really want is like, I just need a really simple way to identify if the level of difficulty of this question actually matches the output, the result. And so it's like, okay, and so what you'll see is, does it match? So, right, I've got it filtered to no, it doesn't match. And then I have level of difficulty, so if I take difficult, I think I'll have to reload, maybe not. We've got a set of questions here. It says, in this one, so these are meant to be difficult questions, right? So again, how do we know we're building efficacious products? So going back to that point, we have to be able to look at the data. We have to be able to look and understand at the content if we're actually doing that. And so here we have, in a deglobalized world, there is, and then here are the answer options. A high degree of exploration, less isolation, more foreign investment, or no importing or exporting. This was set as a difficult question. Would anyone here agree that that's a difficult question? No, because the data, when you look at it, it's so obvious that more than 90% got it right. So there's a mismatch. So what this does is it now gives a very practical set of actions that those content teams can take to take action. So similarly, let's take an easy one. And what you'll see here is, you'll see the same scenario, but in this case, you'll see like a government must divide its resources, which means it must establish. And it says who gets what is the right answer. But the predominant answer was a division of power. So part of what we do, what the content teams do with this information, is to address misconceptions. So there's something that's happening. So again, if everyone that's coming into their learning experience, they're to learn, and they're not learning, how do we address it? We don't want to make the assumption that just because we are working with an author who's a subject matter expert, that they can deliver the content with perfection. Like that they know how every learner learns. The other thing is our authors also are looking for information because they don't know how everybody uses their material. And so we've got some particular authors who are salivating and leverage the information around how learners are actually using their particular content. How are they engaging? And so another thing that we've been doing is inside of our, so using web behavior. So a lot of what I've been showing is kind of outcome data, but now we want to look at web behavior. And this again goes to, are we investing in the right areas of our content? Where do we make these hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment decisions or divestment? And so again, you're talking about a company for most part who's flown blind when it comes to quantitative information. It's based on what a customer has told us. Well, anyone that knows anything, that can be very problematic because what if that customer was having a bad day? Or what if they're just misinformed? Or what if they're completely, the wrong person to ask and you're taking direction from them? And so at the same time, these teams are, they're doing the best with what they can and what they have. And so now what we've been able to do is we've been able to instrument our products. Again, this goes to that data that we hadn't had access to. And what it was is we wanted to see how are people using different assets in the experience. And so in this particular experience, we've got chemistry book by author C in the spring. And you can see across the spring, you can actually see the behavior. So we see a spike in activity in the beginning. And then you see chapter by chapter. And then you see this particular chapter had less activity. But you can, and then we could select yet another author and see what their behavior is. And what's interesting is as we start to look at it is, here's a good example, nutrition. Not a really highly used book. Right? So it was used for chapter 1, but then as you go throughout the semester, or I should say, because this is really based on the table of contents, by chapter, you have a much smaller set of users in that context. So up until this, all we knew is we sold a product, right? So that's what you have to remember what we're working with is all we knew is we were selling products to the marketplace. How are people actually using them? And so what we decided to do is build tools like these that allow us that visibility, but also go back and re-instrument. And like one of the areas that we found really helpful, it's again simple. Here what we're doing is we're able to show a quick histogram on the video assets. So every video asset. The other thing I'll say is this is across thousands of assets. So how do the process of what we put together allows us to scale. So we don't have to build a dashboard for each one. We build one dashboard that connects to the data in that ecosystem that allows us to ultimately scale. So any new assets gets all the same information, gets all the same context. And so what we'll see is 24% of the people actually viewed this particular video that ran 2 minutes, 21 seconds long, 100% of the way through. And so, it can be helpful, or you can find scenarios where you've got a 10-minute long video and 33% of the people make it through, and you go back, and it doesn't mean that the video is too long, which is what I would immediately say is who's going to watch a 10-minute video in the intro of the class, which it may be that, but it could also be maybe it's people are already familiar with the concept. It's the intro. Maybe they've already learned it in a prerequisite. Maybe they don't need that. The reason that matters is because when they go back to make that investment decision of what do we tweak? What do we improve? Do they improve that video? Do they remove the video? Again, using data to actually make decisions for the support of our learners so they know that they're getting the best content so that you as learners, we're working towards your interest. We're working to actually help you in your educational pursuit or your kids. Now the last area that I'm going to go into is, well, now we're taking this product use data and we're now able to look at it from a sales operations perspective. And this is a little bit new, but what we're doing is we're taking this particular area, this territory, this region, I should say, and I'm going to just show you, obviously I've anonymized all the data in all of these for a very specific purpose, but I'll take District Manager 1 for this particular district, who otherwise has almost the same performance, which is he's got number of active users last week. Overall, the percentage of active users is around 67%. By way of context, an active user is someone who's done a meaningful learning activity inside the experience. So meaningful learning activity is not logging in. A meaningful learning activity is somebody who's taken an assessment or done something of meaning. So we're trying to, again, we don't really care, we aren't as focused on how many people we get in, but we're really focused on who we're actually helping. So that's why we're going to say our base is the active folks. That's what we're trying to look for. And those active folks are those that are doing something meaningful. So here, now let's look at, we can see over in this area, overall, the active use is between generally 60 to 69%. These other two are 74%. These two here are a bit of an anomalies, or on the low end, I should say. And so if we look at just this particular territory, 41F, we're going to see a subset of schools. And in the subset of schools, over here, we'll be able to see how many particular active folks were there last week. Overall, what's the average, or what's the percent of active users, and what's the average score? So I'm going to be really clear here. Average score in this context is not the score of the student in the course. This is the average score in the assessments being taken inside the content. So anyone that's an instructor would understand that really quickly. What that means is the instructor, they're the ones responsible. They have multiple sets of content that they may be using or essays and such. we don't have access to that information. We're not privy to that. And that's not what's being shown here. What we're showing is the course score is actually within the particular digital experience. As they're going through that, they come to the end and they take an assessment on that particular content. And it's that assessment score. So we add that as context, because just because there's low activity, it doesn't mean that they're not performing well, right? We don't want to make the assumption that low activity means they're low performers. Again, we're trying to add as much context as possible. In this particular case is to say, where is there potentially a misunderstanding or an opportunity for us to go back and help our customers? Again, these are institutions. So we have institution CC here. Before I click on them, I want you to realize in this case we have anatomy and physiology. You've got around a 60% average activity rate. So that's the norm for that particular territory. The average is 60% of activity across that particular discipline. So I say that because when we drill down to school CC, what you'll see that drop down to 28%. So as a point of comparison, we can see overall that's not what it is. And so the averages are always dangerous because you can't necessarily take the right actions. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to empower folks to take actions at the right level. So now what we can see is, okay, well, course or these particular disciplines have a relatively low activity rate. And in some cases, though, they have a fine score rate. So maybe the instructor's using it just exactly how they want to. And that's what's working well. All this is really saying to Pearson is that we have a potential problem for us, for Pearson, in terms of does the instructor, do they need that much content? Do they need that much information? Do they need those kinds of tools? Are there things that we could do better for this particular institution? But then what we can do is, again, a discipline is still a roll-up. So what we want to do is we want to look at course to course. Are there anomalies, right? Where are the things here? And again, what we're able to do is we're able to see course to course, how are things performing? And so what we're empowering our sales teams and our sales operations teams to now have with their customers are informed conversations. So before, the way that this would work is the salesperson is going to have a conversation. Hey, Professor Johnson, are you planning on renewing next semester? Yeah, Jason, I sure am. Okay, great. And I close it off. The reality is they're probably right. If they're a good salesperson, they probably have a good read on it. However, what they're not going to see is they're not going to see the loss coming. And so what we're able to now use is this behavioral data and use data to actually model and see when would we expect there to be a loss. This isn't to bypass sales. This is really meant to empower sales. And so we're working with that part of the organization to understand what's the best way to inform a conversation. Because now they can go into those conversations informed. They can say, hey, Professor Johnson, what is and isn't working in your course? Of the material, is there something that we could be better about? How are your learners actually using the material? Because now we know they're not, or we know it's very low. And what they'll either discover is that the instructor may not know how their learners are using it, or it's not a factor of the grade, so it's voluntary, and okay, that makes sense, or something else. The last thing that I'll share before I close up is one of the things that we've also been able to do because of that ecosystem is where it allows us to be able to show an institution's view of their performance across the Pearson products. So before, up until this year, we were not able to do this. We could only send parts of data for each, essentially, platform, because we could not connect them. And so now what we're able to do is actually on the institution's terms, we can share with them their information. So we're able to show, in this case, what's the average score, how many courses are there that are happening, what was the number of learners. We can also see what the activity is across the semesters. And we can see how many assessments. We can see people are definitely cramming assessments towards the end of the semester. We can see what the average score across the semesters are. But again, this isn't as relevant until you start to drill in. So when you start to look at math, and you drill just to the math sections, you can start to look at what's our calculus performance? What's our pre-algebra performance? What's our, it's still working. And so what's been powerful about what we've been able to do now is we're able to take this usage information and actually be able to do things that can empower an entire business, not just content development and not just product development. We're able to look at how are people using this information. Again, it's at scale, because you got millions and millions of learners on these platforms, how do you do this in a meaningful way that people are actually able to take action? And so for me, that's what big data is. Big data is only relevant when I can actually act on it, or I will be able to act on it. And so here, what you can see is, in some cases, instructors, they only use it at certain points in the semester. And that's probably exactly as designed, and the performance looks pretty good. And then there are cases where they use it in the beginning and then they stop using it. Well, does that mean they switched books? Is our book a problem? Do we need to address that? Again, now we can have an informed conversation. So the last thing I'll say is, our aim is ultimately learners and educators, and how do we build products that help them? And what I shared with you today are some of the things that we're doing to do that. Right? How do we actually identify if somebody's learning? Then how do we ultimately take those attributes and then help that learner in the future with things like adaptive or personalized learning? We can now take all these parts of their experience and then feed it back into their actual experience with help and study guides. Or we can enable an instructor or an educator with that same information so they can make the decision, what would be best for my students? How do we empower both of those folks? Because the content is if anything, it's an entity in that equation of the learner, the instructor, and the material that they're learning against. So if any of this work sounds interesting, or you know anyone that might be interested, I am hiring. Would love to hear from you or any of your colleagues. I'll also remind you, feedback is a gift. And if you would take a few minutes, either at the end of the session or soon thereafter, provide feedback, I'd greatly appreciate it. And then I know we're kind of close to time, so we do have a few minutes for Q&A if there's any questions. Yes, so the short answer, for those that couldn't hear the question is, I alluded towards the end around, is there a way for us to leverage this kind of product information for instructors or for institutions for their benefit? And the short answer is yes. And that's part of what we're doing now, like that kind of the last view of the institutional view. There's also ways of doing an instructor view. It's taking that information and empowering them, but also, to be honest, a lot of those folks are looking just for the raw data as well, and that's also where we're able to empower them more and more. So we serve a lot of our instructors now, and faculty and educators with raw data, but we're trying to find better ways. And truth be told, too, is we now have new sets of data that we can begin to evaluate. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for joining. I appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of your Tableau conference.